A couple of weeks back, we covered a large study that came out looking at reasons people go back to conventional vehicles after owning either plug-in hybrids or battery electric vehicles. The study's headline-grabbing number was that roughly 20% of plug-in vehicle owners discontinued ownership and went back to a non-plug-in vehicle. That number got a lot of traction in the media because it's much higher than anecdotally we'd expect. The reporting mainly cited a couple of correlates to no longer owning a plug-in vehicle, not being male, and charging infrastructure. While satisfaction with the charging infrastructure seemed likely to correlate with continued EV ownership, the 20% figure, that seemed surprisingly high, given that none of us know anyone who has traded in their EV for a non-EV, at least not personally, though we do sometimes get comments from viewers who have. But that is definitely bias, and as we know, bias creeps into everything we do and can give us completely incorrect ideas about reality. So we decided to take a deeper look at the paper and followed up with some questions for the research team. That way, we can give you a bit of context and talk about what the figure does and does not mean. And we can also say what the research does say about reasons for EV discontinuance. The first and most important thing is how they got to that 20% figure. The original study was based on 4 surveys of Californian EV purchasers who applied for a rebate from the California Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. People who bought their cars between 2012 and 2019 were surveyed. There were around 2,700 respondents, or about 7.5% of clean vehicle buyers in California. That is a pretty healthy response rate. The data for this survey was obtained by contacting the people from the original 4 surveys who had agreed to follow-up surveys. Just over half of the original respondents were still contactable, and they were invited to respond. Just over 4,000 finished the questionnaire. But here's where it gets tricky though. The 20% discontinuance figure, that comes from people who have made an ownership decision between 2015 and 2019. Buying or selling your car, trading it in, that is an ownership decision. However, for the purposes of this study, just keeping your car and not replacing it, that's not considered an ownership decision. The study is only based on people whose car ownership changed, not on anyone who just kept driving their car. So yes, roughly 20% of those who changed vehicle did stop driving an EV or a PHEV. However, for people who completed the study, and remember this is a sample of 4,000 people out of 350 plus thousand plug-in vehicle purchasers, over 90% of owners either had their original EV or PHEV or had a new plug-in vehicle, leaving around 9% abandoning plug-in vehicles for a variety of reasons. Now, whether that will hold true as more owners who've leased their vehicles change cars, or owners decide their first PHEV or EV is getting a bit long in the tooth, that's the question. But it's really important as a piece of context that's buried in the methods section of the paper. Okay, so the headline-grabbing stuff dealt with. What can the paper tell us? Well, some of it gets a bit muddy because if you cast your mind back to 2012, when the earliest purchasers in the survey bought their cars, the range of vehicles available was somewhat different to today, as was also the case with the infrastructure. At the top end of the market, you had the Tesla Model S. But if you didn't have north of $60,000 to throw at a car, the range of vehicles and their abilities was somewhat less than stellar. Obviously, the antediluvian first-generation Nissan Leaf and the also-ran Mitsubishi i-MiEV were there, as was the lease-only Honda Fit EV and the short-lived Coda sedan and the WeGo Life. Even Ford had their Ford Focus EV, a regular Ford Focus, but with a trunk full of batteries. In nearly all of these vehicles, DC fast charging, if they had it available, was an optional extra, making road tripping functionally impossible. And with a range of under 100 miles per charge, even in the best conditions for nearly everything on the list, There were some lifestyle compromises that had to be made to have this as your main vehicle on the west coast of the USA. Add to that the fact that for the earliest buyers across the state of California, there were just 400 charging stations. So for early purchasers, particularly buyers of non-Tesla EVs, the charging experience was almost certainly pretty trying. Unfortunately, the study didn't structure questions that would allow you to tease out which vehicles had rapid charging and what proportion of owners who had that feature used those facilities. Similarly, the more complicated question of if you don't have charging at home but you do have DC rapid charging or charging at work, is that enough to encourage you to stay with a plug-in vehicle? That isn't answerable. But it definitely is a question that needs following up on. One thing that is answerable is which brands put you off buying another plug-in. Well, first upon that list is Fiat, which is interesting because the cute little Fiat 500e is something of a popular vehicle with us. But with its uninspiring range and lack of DC rapid charging, that's a possible cause for owners abandoning those early Fiat 500s. But Fiat don't actually head up that list. Over half of Hyundai plug-in owners went on to buy a non-plug-in vehicle next. That is a terrible statistic. I would really love to tease out what exactly happened there. Okay, so what brands inspired people to stick with a plug? You all think you know what I'm going to say, and I'm not. Because it's not the all-American, all-electric brand that you think it is. It's Cadillac. No, I'm not joking. Cadillac tops the list with 100% of owners' next purchases being another plug-in vehicle. Granted, there were only 3 Caddy respondents. Okay, so next on the top 3 is... No, it's still not Tesla. No, it's actually Honda, who came in second with over 92% of owners' next choice being another clean vehicle. In this case, it's just 26 owners, though. Okay, so coming in third and in a strong place on percentage and over 90% of owners, and a strong performer with 160 owners, Tesla. Tesla owners went on to buy another EV. And no, I don't know whether they went on to buy another Tesla. That isn't in the survey data. Okay, so on to some of the other headline grabbers that came from this. The website Ars Technica said that not being male was correlated with discontinuing EV ownership. Since I, and a lot of other women I know, hate visiting gas stations with their delightful opportunities to meet interesting people, that seems surprising. And interestingly, it's not exactly supported by the data. It is true for plug-in hybrids. Women were more likely to abandon plug-in ownership if their prior vehicle was a plug-in hybrid, but it wasn't so true for fully electric vehicles. Since one of the tangential benefits of an EV is rarely having to visit for service, and having had enough things that weren't actually wrong with my cars mansplained to me over the years, I can understand that rarely having to visit a service centre is a particular delight. So it does seem reasonable that ownership of a fully electric vehicle with their much reduced service needs correlates with continued ownership, regardless of gender. Some other interesting correlates for transitioning back to a non-plug-in vehicle are owning another vehicle. The study didn't distinguish between owning a second plug-in or owning a gasoline car, but owning a second vehicle fairly strongly correlated with continuing to own at least one plug-in vehicle. That certainly fits with the ownership pattern you might expect for older, shorter range EVs. If you have a daily driver that's an EV without rapid charging, and a second vehicle for longer trips, that makes sense. For example, we have one long-range EV and our somewhat shorter range BMW i3. Driving the i3 on long journeys is certainly more tedious, and you have to be a fairly hardened EV lover to put up with its 60-mile hops as your only long-range vehicle, which it was for a while. And I can certainly see how the temptation would be there to go back to gasoline if that was your only car, particularly if it was a variant that lacked rapid charging. Also, as the efficiency of the second vehicle increases, the odds of discontinuing plug-in ownership decrease. which may correlate to people who care more about efficiency wanting to keep plug-in vehicles, or it may be that people who can comfortably afford two efficient vehicles are more able to keep them. Oh, and interestingly, longer commutes were also associated with continuing plug-in ownership. Some factors that were perhaps also what you'd expect, the more satisfied owners were with convenience and cost of charging, the less likely it is that they would stop owning a plug-in vehicle. This in the media was often shorthanded to charging infrastructure, but it turns out that it's much more nuanced than that. Unsurprisingly, having access to home charging turns out to be pretty important, but otherwise, pretty much nothing was statistically significant regarding location of charging access. So it didn't matter whether folks had work or public charging for continued ownership. What did matter exclusively for pure electrics seems to have been the difference between accessibility of level 2 versus level 1 charging at home. The question of whether the owners who had level 2 charging were more committed to EV ownership up front, or whether they had better access or property ownership issues that meant that they couldn't install level 2 charging, is something that also needs digging into. So that's the major findings and major caveats. There's lots more to dig into, and there's also a lot that just needs more research, but as usual the headline findings need some context to make sense, which is why we're here. So, what questions about EV ownership do you want answered? Drop us a note in the comments below, and remember, play nice. That's it for today. As always, thanks to the folks on my right for being our $15 to $49 a month patrons. Special thanks to our $50 a month patrons, Anonymous Freak, Raging Fellows, Gordon C., Paul Conway, Laura Sanborn, Anthony Coates, Denny Hyde, Sean Ueda, and Tesla in the Gong. And our deepest gratitude to our $100 a month patron supporters, John Lyons, Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, JP Fagerback, Will Graylan, and Ian. If you'd like to join the ranks of wonderful supporters, you'll find links below to Patreon, Bitcoin, and Ko-fi. Chat with the team and the TE fans over at Discord, and if you'd like to buy some TE swag, just head over to our Redbubble store. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving.